Boldwood presents The Tobacco Girls, written by Lizzie Lane and read by Anne Dover. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Chapter 1. Late July 1939. Maisie Miles. Slight of stature, dark-haired and dark-eyed, 15-year-old Maisie Miles was currently engrossed in a world of her own. Though the newspaper sellers and the wireless shouted warnings of war to come, it meant nothing to her. The world, her surroundings and everything else was blanked out by the letter she'd almost snatched from the postman's hand. She'd bobbed out of that front door 10 times at least that morning, waiting for him to come so she could grab the letter before he had chance to shove it through the letterbox. Hopefully, it would be her ticket out of York Street, the Dings, and the larger area that was St. Philip's Marsh. The envelope was blue, the paper of a quality she'd never encountered before. The letter inside matched the envelope, both in colour and quality. Her brown eyes glowed, and her creamy complexion burst into pinkness as she read the letter for the 3rd time.
Dear Miss Miles, in response to the reference I received from your teacher, Miss Smith, and the fact that since leaving school you've experienced some domestic work in the kitchen of the Royal Hotel in Bristol, I'm delighted to offer you the position of kitchen maid at Priory House, Long Ashton, which, as I'm sure you know, is just outside the city of Bristol and not far from Ashton Court.
Feeling sublimely happy, Maisie closed her eyes and held the letter to her heart.
Bliss! Green fields and trees!
She'd never been to Ashton Court, but the redoubtable Miss Smith had told her that the sumptuous mansion had been built with the proceeds of a vast sugar plantation on the island of Jamaica. The letter had come from the housekeeper, who was known personally to Miss Smith.
A much respected acquaintance, she had told Maisie. It's a private house, so only glimpse through the gates.
It was obvious from her tone that Miss Smith herself had never been into the house, but would very much like to. For her part, Maisie wasn't interested in the house. It was the prospect of fresh air, far away from the stink of York Street, which attracted her. The house she'd grown up in was situated in the Dings, a sub-district of St. Philip's, a less than salubrious area of Bristol, where the air was thick with the stench of boneyards, soapworks, and slaughterhouses. Added to the cloying stench was the deafening rattle from the marshalling yards, stretching from Midland Road to Lawrence Hill, a sprawling expanse of glistening rails linking the Great Western Railway with the Midland Railway. Like the smell, the railway never ceased. The goods trucks shunting backwards and forwards, chains clanking, metal rails squealing beneath metal wheels. Of late it had been busier and noisier than usual. The old man, the old sod her father, declared it was all to do with impending war because it said so in the papers. As if he would know. She'd never seen him read anything. It was more likely he'd heard the newspaper vendor shouting out the news from his pitch outside the King's Cinema in Old Market. Maisie didn't care. All she wanted was to get away to something better. There was nothing attractive about No. 5 York Street. It had a yard at the back, a patch of dusty dirt between the back of the house and the brick privy that lurched against the far wall. It was a place of mouldy walls and cramped rooms, packed with shabby furniture, and a cold hearth that even when lit did little to warm one room, let alone the whole house.
"What you got there?"
Suddenly, the very air was ripe with menace. Absorbed in the letter and her future, she hadn't heard her father, Frank Miles, rouse himself from the old cracked sofa in the living room. Pushing her with one hefty hand, he grabbed the letter with the other. Maisie did her best to snatch it back, but was brushed so roughly aside that she crashed heavily against the wall, and a patch of flaking plaster crumpled into her hair. Bleary-eyed, he blinked at the letter, mouthing the words as he read each one, like a child who cannot quite understand his letters. "What the bleeding hell's this about, then?" His accent was heavy. His flabby jowls quivered, and his bloodshot eyes fixed her with a familiar look, the kind usually followed with a cuff round the ear or a punch to her shoulder. In his youth, he might have been a handsome man, but booze and smoking, plus the advent of age, had blunted all that. The circumstances of her upbringing and ongoing abuse had toughened Maisie. She gathered her courage, folded her arms in front of her, and held her chin high. He scared her, but to show fear would only make things worse. "I've got a job in Long Ashton as a kitchen maid. I'll be living in. The job at the Royal was all right, but this is better. You won't have to keep me any longer, and you'll have more room." Pointing out the advantages to him was the only hope she had of getting him to fall in with what she wanted. For a moment he stared at her, then burst out laughing. "Oh, you ain't going anywhere. Think I've kept you all these bloody years to be a kitchen maid? I want paying back, so you, my girl, is going to work at Wells's. I wants your wages, and I wants the free fags you'll be getting." Fear seeped into her defiance, but Maisie still managed to shake her head. "I ain't working in a factory. I wants to go and live in the country. That's what I'm going to do." Frank Miles's fleshy lips sprawled into a cruel grin. His face was greasy with sweat. "Well, you ain't doing that." His tone was spiced with the pleasure he derived from being cruel, as there before her very eyes he tore the letter into quarters, struck a match, and set it alight. "No!" Maisie sprang forward, stabbing her fingers into the flame, but was too late to save a single word. The letter that had promised her a different world fluttered like black feathers to the floor. In a trice, her father took hold of her by the throat with one meaty hand. His eyes glared into hers. "You owe me for looking after you. Now I wants me dues." She grabbed at his hand, trying to unwind those fingers from her throat before he squeezed the life out of her. Her mouth opened and shut like a fish gasping for air. "I'm your daughter," she wanted to shout, but it came out as a faltering gasp. "Are you?" he snarled. "Are you?" For one dreadful moment, she thought he was going to kill her. There was such hatred in his eyes. There'd been other times when she had seen that look, when his hand had cuffed her head and sent her sprawling. This time was worse. The clanking of beer bottles heralded the arrival of her mother. Her father threw her aside, and she rubbed at the soreness of her neck, still gasping for breath. Her mother, a cigarette hanging from the corner of her mouth, struggled in with a large leather bag. Frank Miles turned his bad temper on her. "You been some time? Should have been back long before now." As usual, her mother pretended nothing was wrong, lifting the bag onto the table as though it was the most important task in the world. In a way, it was. Frank liked his beer, and Gwen Miles always did her best to keep on the right side of him. To do otherwise, and she'd be the one getting a beating. "The off-licence was busy. I had to wait, and then everybody was looking up at that plane. Did you see it? A Bristol Beaufighter, that's what they said it was called. There's loads of them being made out at Fullerton in case there's a war. But the one that flew today's the first one. Everyone was dead excited that it was being built here and that there might be a war." Frank Miles raised a threatening fist. "Well, I ain't. You goes on an errand and gets back here. You don't spend your time gawping up at the bloody sky." Gwen Miles flinched and barely glanced in Maisie's direction because she dared not. The bloke she wished she'd never married had a short temper and liked lashing out. Any sign of sympathy for her daughter would result in her receiving a black eye, a broken finger.
"There, stupid cow," he said,
pointing a yellow-stained finger at Maisie.
"Put herself down for a job as a bleeding kitchen maid at some fancy country house."
Her mother blinked, looked at Maisie, then back again at her husband, afraid to say the wrong thing.
"What sort of house was it, then?"
she tried.
"That's not the point," he shouted straight into her face. "She ain't leaving here. She's lived under my roof all her life, and I wants paying back."
Her mother winced, and her face visibly paled. She'd always been paler than Maisie, but of late there was a greyish tinge. The only brighter spots of colour were when she was sporting the blue and yellow of a black eye.
"So, what you got in mind?"
she asked, her eyes avoiding those of her daughter, her hands trembling with nerves.
"I'll tell you what I've got in mind," he said,
purposely standing between Maisie and the door.
"Tomorrow you take your daughter along to the Labour Exchange and get her taken on at Wells's."
"Oh, I don't know about that," she said, frowning as she took off her headscarf. "I don't know that they're taking anyone on." She seemed suddenly diminished in size when Frank Miles pressed his face close to hers.
"Of course they're taking on, you stupid cow. Wells's are always taking on. Now you take her down there tomorrow."
Her chest heaving with anger and disappointment, Maisie took advantage of the situation and dashed for the door. Her father's angry voice shouted after her, "Oi, I ain't finished with you." But Maisie didn't stop. She headed for the railway bridge in Midland Road, staring down onto the railway lines as she wondered at the hopelessness of her life. The lure of working in the country, far away from here, had buoyed up her spirits during the weeks before she'd left school. "It's just a matter of time before you get a reply," her teacher had said. "You're intelligent and always do your best, and with my help I'm sure you'll get the job." Her teacher had been right on one count, but had presumed her parents would be pleased. The trouble was, Miss Smith was a gentle soul and had no real idea of what they were like, how mean and cruel her father was, and how downtrodden her mother. A pair of arms joined hers in leaning on the bridge parapet. An elbow nudged her arm.
"Ain't going to throw yourself over, are you?" "Nobody would care if I did." "You're my favourite little sister. I'd be gutted." "I'm your only sister," she responded. Alf laughed. "That's true." He was her older brother. He had a wicked grin, a handsome face, and his looks were totally the opposite to her own. Whereas she was short with a mass of curly black hair and brown eyes, he was tall with blue eyes and corn-coloured hair. His fingers were long, his nails clean and neatly trimmed. His only flaw was that he followed where his father led. Both made a living by stealing, either from commercial premises or from the posh houses in Clifton on the north side of the river overlooking the Avon Gorge. The river ran far below those houses, spanned from one side to the other by the Clifton Suspension Bridge, a wonder of Victorian engineering built by the great engineer Isambard Kingdom Brunel. The big difference between father and son was that Alf had never been violent towards either her or her mother. He could be tough, but not with his own family. Maisie turned and looked at her brother's handsome profile, saw his well-combed hair, his tailored, double-breasted suit. Her nose twitched at the heady scent of cologne. "Where you been, then?" she asked. Her brother flicked the stub of a cigarette down onto the railway line. "With friends?" "Lucky you. Wish I had some friends," she said, glumly. The truth was that she did have friends, though only at school. They'd kept their distance from her and her family.
The Miles family had a reputation, and she'd heard rumours of her father's wandering hands. Alf offered her a cigarette. "It'll calm you down, and you can tell me all about it." "If I smoke, I'll end up smelling like our dad. He stinks. I hate him." "Ah," Alf exclaimed. "So that's why you're out here. The old bugger's had a go at you. Come on, tell me all about it." Alf was the only bright spark in her life. Maisie's narrow shoulders, stiff with tension up until his arrival, began to relax as she told him why she was out here, feeling her life was at an end before it had even started. "I want to get away from here, Alf, but that old bugger won't let me." Her brother listened patiently and with kindness in his eyes. His little sister was the only female he truly loved. He could remember her as a baby lying in a cot covered by a thin blanket and sucking on an old camp coffee bottle filled with milk. The funny thing was, although he was old enough to do so, he couldn't recall his mother being pregnant. In fact, he couldn't recall those months before her birth at all. He remained silent for a while, once she'd finished what she was saying. Then, as though he'd come to a conclusion, he took out a packet of Passing Cloud, one of the best W.D. and H.O. Wills produced, and made only from the finest Virginia tobacco. Alf took great pride in smoking something made from tobacco produced in the United States of America. It had come all the way across the Atlantic to Avonmouth, Bristol's larger port that sprawled at the mouth of the river. Ships still did make their way beneath the Clifton Suspension Bridge and up the river, but those who discharged their cargoes at Avonmouth were too large to navigate its treacherous bends and glutinous mudbanks. Alf liked hearing sailors' tales of where those ships had been, places he'd never heard of that fired his imagination. "Well, it ain't the end of the world," Alf finally said. "You'll be well paid, and you'll make good friends at Wills's." He lowered his head so that his blue eyes were looking directly into her brown ones. "I'm telling you the truth, our Maisie. You've only just left school, but believe me, you'll find your feet and make the most of things. You'll make good mates, too. I guarantee it. Give it a bit of time, and if a war starts, there might not be any factory. They reckon there'll be more bombs than the last war. Might see the end of this place, too." He jerked his chin into the night. As though in response, the lonely screech of a train whistle split the night. The lights were on in the marshalling yards, black shapes moving around in clouds of steam, even at this time of night. Like hell, she thought, and wondered if something much better might replace it. Chapter 2. Bridget Milligan. Bridget wasn't sure what time it was when her eyes flicked open, but she did know some strange low sound had disturbed her, and she had to see what it was. The first thing she did was to check her two sisters, with whom she shared a double bed. They were both sound asleep, their gentle breathing warm and soft against the palm of her hand. Katie was 7, a rosy-cheeked little girl with chubby hands and a rosebud mouth. Ruby was 10, darker-haired and like her siblings, Bridget included, possessing the brightest of blue eyes. Bridget smiled. The family of 7 children and 2 adults were crammed into 3 bedrooms, and the house was always noisy, mealtimes a scramble to grab what you could before it was all gone. Some of their neighbours looked down their noses at the Milligan family. Bridget had heard their comments. "Typical Irish. Him and her should learn to control theirselves." For the most part she ignored the remarks, but sometimes, just sometimes, she lashed out. "Hypocrites! At least our little uns aren't hanging around outside pub doors, waiting for their parents to come out." Bridget prided herself on her use of words, and although she was of a serene disposition, she stuck up for her family and what she believed in. The sound persisted, and it worried her. She remembered another time, something similar, the cries of pain. She shook the memory from her mind. Her mother had been pregnant, and she was pregnant again. Being careful not to disturb them, she swung her legs out of bed and went to check on her two youngest sisters, 6-year-old Mary and 5-year-old Molly, who slept top and tail in a single bed on the far side of the room. One of them murmured for water. Bridget took the mug of water kept on the window ledge for such eventualities and let her sister take a sip before lowering her head back down on the pillow. Thinking there might be something happening in the street outside, she peered out of the open window. Nothing stirred in any of the unending council houses lining Marksbury Road. There were many such houses built by Bristol City Council to house a growing population that expected more after the carnage of the Great War. The low murmuring continued. So Bridget decided to check on Sean and Michael, her two brothers, who shared a 3/4-size bed in the box room. Taking great care, she opened the bedroom door and stepped out onto the landing. Before she had chance to check the boys, her parents' bedroom door opened and her father appeared. He was in his pyjamas, one leg of which was empty, which meant his false leg was still propped in position at the side of the bed. Even in the semi-gloom of the landing, she could see the anxious look on his face.
"The baby's coming too early," he gasped. "Your mother needs you."
Nausea, prompted by fear, formed a knot in Bridget's stomach.
"Dad, I don't know nothing about bringing babies into the world. I'll run for Mrs. Knight."
The truth be told, she would run for anyone who could help. She'd seen her mother give birth to her youngest brother and felt sick at the sight of it.
How could any woman go through such pain, and the gore, the stench of a body expelling bloody innards?
Her mother cried out,
"Bridget, me girl, I need you, Bridie."
Bridie was the affectionate term of address her mother kept for special occasions, those when she was doubly proud of her, like when she won the history prize at school, which she seemed to do every year without fail. Being called by that name had always made her feel special, which was why she couldn't ignore it now. Carefully, so as not to knock over her father, who had lost his leg during the Great War, she eased past him into the room. Once the door was closed behind them, the main light was switched on.
"Should I get water?"
asked her father. He sounded very panicked for a man who had fathered a family of 7 children. Mary Milligan, Bridget's mother, intervened.
"It's too early, Patrick. Do you hear me? It won't live. Just over 6 months,"
she said to her daughter, before her eyes closed and she gritted her teeth against the pain. Bridget told her father to strap on his leg and fetch up a pile of old newspapers.
"And a bucket of water, not too hot, not too cold."
Same as the last time, she thought. Though she sounded brave, inside she was remembering how it had been before. The prospect of what was about to happen had scared her then, and it still scared her now. Once he was gone, her mother pushed down the bedclothes and told Bridget to pull up her nightgown. Bridget winced. Her mother's belly was criss-crossed with purple streaks. It was also heaving from side to side and downwards towards her mother's thick bush of pubic hair. The room seemed hotter than it was, yet the windows were wide open, the early morning Sunday air gently lifting the curtains. Bridget clenched her fists and with anxious eyes regarded her mother's face. She looked drained and in dreadful pain, which made Bridget feel doubly helpless, and also aware that the heat she was feeling was her own fear. The sound of clunking from the stairs heralded the return of her father. With great dexterity, he closed the door behind him with his tin foot, one arm tucked around a bundle of newspapers, the other carrying a bucket of warm water. A clean towel was draped over his shoulder.
"Anything happened?"
he asked nervously. Bridget thought how boyish he looked, and understood why her mother had fallen for him, and allowed him to give her so many children. Too many, Bridget thought to herself. Before she could answer, her father had retreated to the door. "I'd better go, I suppose."
"You'll do no such thing," said Bridget.
"I'll lift her hips and you spread the newspaper underneath her." Her father's jaw dropped, though only momentarily. It wasn't usually done for a father to be present at a birth or a miscarriage, but Patrick Milligan was a resilient chap, and besides, this was his wife lying here in pain. Having a care for her mother's modesty, Bridget pulled the voluminous nightgown down.
"I think I can manage," her mother whispered.
Nevertheless, Bridget helped her lift her loins, whilst her father slid the newspaper beneath her rump. Almost immediately, there was a rush of blood and fluid.
"More newspaper,"
Bridget demanded, keeping her voice low so her siblings wouldn't wake up and see their mother in this painful and immodest state. Her mother groaned through gritted teeth, her jaw so tense it seemed as though it would break under the pressure. With a final rush of fluid and blood, the baby slid out onto the newspaper. Mary Milligan's chest heaved, her breath coming in quick rasps as her body sought to regain normality, refresh the energy and blood that she'd lost. Patrick Milligan went to his wife's side. "'Tis all over, me darling, 'tis all over." Mary's eyes fluttered, and a smile that was as much sadness as relief creased her tired lips.
"It's too early for it to live," said Bridget's mother.
She looked directly at her daughter, as though expecting an answer. Bridget hesitated before wrapping the bloodied form in the newspaper. She was no expert, but she could see that something was very wrong. The baby's spine was like a herringbone with the flesh peeled off. It was ill-formed, bringing Bridget to the conclusion that even if the pregnancy had gone full term, the baby, a boy, would not have lived. A slight crying came from one of the other bedrooms. "It's one of the boys," she said to her father. He nodded and went to deal with whatever the problem was. Bridget wrapped the small corpse in one layer after another before tending to her mother's needs, pulling out the afterbirth, reaching for more newspaper, washing her mother, and applying a sanitary dressing. She felt her mother's eyes looking at her.
"You're a good girl, Bridie. I'll be there for you when your babes are aching to be born."
Bridget, sweat running down her face, paused in what she was doing. Her mother noticed her pained expression and misinterpreted. "Don't worry. You're a fair-looking girl, and one day you'll find the love of your life, just as I did your father, and you'll have babies for him. Trust me, girl, you will." Her mother sighed, and her eyes closed in welcome sleep. As she waited for her father to take them for disposal, Bridget stared at the bundle containing a baby, the other the afterbirth. Her mouth felt dry, and her stomach heaved with nausea. Just 18 years of age, and this was the second time she'd been present during one of her mother's pregnancies. The first time had disgusted her. This second one had chilled her to the bone and brought her to a determined conclusion. She would never allow herself to go through this, and if that meant never falling in love and getting married, then so be it. A few hours later, the worst was over, and her mother was threatening to get up, despite the traumatic event she'd just gone through. Bridget insisted she stayed in bed. "I'll do breakfast, then take the kids out somewhere."
"Oh, yes,"
sighed her mother, and managed a weak smile.
"Take them to Vicky Park. A bit of fresh air'll do them good. Now stop fussing with them pillows and get yourself some breakfast."
Bridget stopped fussing with the pillows, but didn't remark that the last thing she wanted was breakfast. No matter the fresh air doing the kids some good, it would do her good too.
"It's a nice day, so I thought I might take them for a picnic on Brandon Hill.
We can get a tram to the centre and walk up from there." Her mother's watery smile tugged at her heart. "Yes," she said, her voice as weak as her smile.
"That would be nice. There's a lovely view from up there."
After telling her mother to get some rest and not to worry, Bridget closed the bedroom door. Her father had already started organising breakfast, though was cutting the bread too quickly. Bridget took the knife from him before he could do more damage. With expert precision, she began to cut the thicker slices into two.
"I need some for sandwiches," she said to him. "We're going on a picnic. Do you hear that, kids? We're going on a picnic."
A mix of hoorays, laughter, and excited chatter erupted. Her father looked at her gratefully, and she had no doubt there were tears in his eyes. "You're a good girl, Bridget. Whoever marries you is going to get the best woman in the world." Bridget looked away, her lips set in a straight line, because her father's hope was his, and not hers. Never could she envisage becoming a wife, but couldn't put the terror she felt into words. Her mother had given birth to one child after another. She'd heard the groans, sometimes the screams, and knew she never wanted to go through that kind of pain. After the rigours of the early hours of this morning, she was doubly sure. The fresh air of Brandon Hill went some way to clearing her head, though did little to diminish the smells, the sounds, and the consequences. Bridget felt great joy watching her brothers and sisters peeling off their shoes and socks and running barefooted through the grass. It pleased her that they had no knowledge of what had happened earlier. They were children, and should stay that way for as long as possible. She'd brought 2 bottles of sherbet mixed with water contained in 2 old Tizer bottles with clipped-down lids. Everything was spread out on an old tablecloth, and no invitation to eat was needed. Everyone was ravenous. Once it was all gone, they lay back in the grass, looking up at the blue sky, or sat up, gazing at the city spires.
"There's a lot of churches,"
said 12-year-old Sean, the eldest of her 2 brothers. Bridget was a great reader, and if funds had allowed, would have liked to be a teacher. As it was, she had to stick to reading. Any book she came across devoured with great gusto. It was at times like these that she passed on the information she had learned.
"Bristol was called the city of churches. It had so many, and the most beautiful is St. Mary Redcliffe." "Who said so?"
asked Michael, who was 9 and beginning to question everything.
"Queen Elizabeth I, back in the 16th century.
Michael jerked his chin at the edifice behind them that dominated Brandon Hill.
"What about this tower? Is that a church?"
"No, I told you before we came that it's called Cabot Tower. It was named after a 15th century explorer who discovered America. Not just the islands of the Caribbean like Columbus a couple of years before him, but the continent of America. It's said he landed at a place he christened Newfoundland. You see? New found land." It was always wise to get in with an answer before Michael could actually ask the question. It was time to go home, and they were packing up, the sun dipping into the skyline, when a whole chorus of church bells rang out over the city, inviting the faithful to evensong, but not the Milligan family, or at least not all of them. Her mother was a regular at Mass, but her father was not. Neither did he insist on his children going, though her mother usually managed to take the younger ones with her until they rebelled and followed her father's line. "Your conscience is your own, and for you to answer to." A smell of smoke greeted them when they got back to Marksbury Road. "No roast dinner today," Bridget said to the kids. "It's cold meat and bread and dripping, and I think there's some blancmange left." Too tired to complain, her siblings tucked in. Presuming her mother was hungry, she spread beef dripping onto a slice of bread and, along with a cup of tea, took it up to her mother. "Thought you might need this," she said, with a cheery smile. It wasn't entirely a surprise to see her mother sitting up in bed, nestled into a knitted bed jacket. She'd bounded back the last time too, her concerns for the family outweighing any personal considerations.
"Put it there," she said, patting a place on the eider-down. "So, how was Brandon Hill?" We left the grass a bit downtrodden, but Cabot Tower's still intact," she said with a smile. "Can I get you anything else, Ma?" "No, this'll do fine," said her mother, as she sipped at her tea. Both ignored the smell of bonfire smoke drifting in through the open window. Dusk was falling by the time Bridget was going downstairs with the empty cup and plate. She left them in the kitchen and went out to where her father was prodding at a blazing bonfire, the source of the smoke that was lazily curling upwards. A lump came to her throat when she looked down at the fire. Together, they stood there silently, neither needing to use words to state how they were feeling. As the last of the burning bundles turned to ash, Bridget dared look at her father's face and saw the tears streaming down his cheeks. Chapter 3. Phyllis Mason. Phyllis had reddish hair, greenish eyes, and a heartfelt ambition to go to work in smart clothes rather than an overall. "Know your place," her mother had declared when she dared mention enrolling on a typing course. "Stop trying to be better than you are. Working class you were born, and working class you'll remain." That was the end of the matter as far as her mother was concerned, but no matter how she tried, Phyllis couldn't get the idea out of her mind, so she applied anyway. Her mother, Stella Mason, believed her advice sound. Phyllis had a good job at the tobacco factory and was engaged to Robert, who wasn't exciting but was dependable. What more could she want? With her heart in her mouth, she posted off her request for details, though not without letting her best friend Bridget Milligan in on the secret. "I don't want it delivered here, or me mum'll chuck it in the bin." It was arranged for it to be delivered to Bridget's, which wasn't that far from where Phyllis lived with her mother. The letter finally got to her on Sunday morning, luckily coinciding with Sunday morning service at the Methodist chapel. Not that her mother was that religious, but as a widow it was one of the few occasions she went out that wasn't for shopping. "It's a bit of company," she said, when squeezing her hair beneath her church hat, a black, sombre affair with a bunch of green feathers at the side. "Now you be all right till I get back, won't you?" Of course she would. As luck would have it, the brown manila envelope she'd been expecting had arrived second post at the Milligan house on Saturday. It didn't get to her until Sunday morning, the best time it could possibly arrive. She opened the door to Sean, the eldest of Bridget's two brothers. His hair looked freshly combed, and he was wearing his best clothes. "Hello, Sean. You off to Mass, then?" He shivered when he shook his head, as though the very idea frightened him to death. "Not today," he beamed gratefully. "Our bridie can't come. She's getting the food ready to take us on a picnic, as our mum's not well." "Have a good time," she called after him, after taking the envelope. Then he was gone, his feet kicking out furiously behind him, as though that alone would put wings on his feet. "What's he doing here?" Her mother was back. Another few minutes, and she would not have known of the letter's arrival. A few minutes, thought Phyllis, as she half closed her eyes. Why couldn't God have kept you at chapel a bit longer? Realising that her good luck had suddenly turned bad, Phyllis's heart beat faster, and it was hard not to look guilty. Her mother frowned at the envelope. "Are you going to open that, or what?" said her mother, as she took off her hat before stabbing it with a hat pin. "It's not that important," Phyllis said, in a nonchalant manner, though in actuality she thought it the most important thing she'd done in her life. She felt her mother's hard look, eyes as sharp as knives, lips set in a firm pout. Stella Mason liked to know whatever her daughter was up to.
I'm not interfering. I've just got your best interests at heart, Phyllis. So listen to your mother. Mother knows best." The same stanza was so frequently repeated that Phyllis could recite it off by heart. Phyllis felt the full force of those shrew-like eyes dissecting her as sharply and ably as a surgeon's knife. "If it's anything to do with that business about learning to type, I'd throw it in the bin if I were you. Robert wouldn't like it. Men don't like their wives to work, and Robert's no exception. So I'm telling you, my girl, it's too late in the day for you to be thinking about learning anything. Like every other girl, you're going to be a housewife and a mother. What's the point of being anything else? You've got your man. Leave it at that." She'd guessed right, and feeling great shame at being found out, Phyllis turned guiltily away, protectively holding the envelope against her chest. She took a deep breath and said what she already knew would be a lie. "You're right. I shouldn't have bothered. I'll throw it in the bin." "No, you should not have bothered," her mother exclaimed. "Robert's got a good job. He'll never be unemployed. There'll always be a meal on the table married to a bloke like him. He hasn't got a head full of wild ideas, not like your father, not like him at all." The last words were delivered through gritted teeth. Part of Phyllis wanted to stick up for her father. He'd done his best. How was he to know that labouring on the Canadian wheat prairies would dry up, that the harvest would fail, that the depression would affect the whole world? Neither was he to know that the Canadian government would pass a bill effectively deporting the unemployed and others who dared claim public funds. But he did try to better himself, she wanted to say. He did try, and she too wanted to try. Gripping the brown manila envelope with both hands, Phyllis went out back to where a zinc ash bin sat next to the door to the coal house. At first she hesitated, lid in one hand, envelope in the other. Then she thought of Celia Ward Bond, a secretary in the offices at W.D. and H.O. Wills, who she'd seen from a distance, notebook in hand, trailing along behind a member of management. She'd looked both efficient and glamorous, in her navy blue suit, her glossy blonde hair fashioned into an elegant chignon at the nape of her neck. "And I bet she doesn't smell of tobacco," Phyllis thought to herself. Only the girls on the factory floor smelt of tobacco, the dust settling in their hair and on their clothes, despite wearing overalls. At least there was Bridget and all the other girls. At times it felt like one big family, everybody supporting each other. She could see their faces, hear their laughter, and giggle at their jokes. Still, she thought, I'll still see them. Sometimes. There was Robert to consider, of course. He might not approve, but she was sure she could persuade him to see her point of view. If he loved her, he would, and besides he worked in an office himself. Surely he would eventually understand, and even be proud of her ambition to be something more than a girl stripping tobacco leaves. She wanted to be Celia Ward Bond. In a moment of instant decision that she might in time regret, Phyllis set down the dustbin lid, folded the envelope and shoved it inside her blouse. Just to make sure it was believed she had disposed of it, she lifted the lid and banged it down onto the bin loudly enough for her mother to hear. She would keep the letter, think about it, and perhaps in time she would post it off or resign it to the bin, just as her mother advised. Robert was coming round to take her out at 6:30, and Phyllis was almost ready. She was just about to apply lipstick when she sensed her mother eyeing her with a mixture of disapproval and surprise. "Aren't you forgetting something?" Her tone of voice was as disapproving as her look. "You know Robert doesn't like you wearing lipstick." Her hand paused in mid-action. Robert Harvey didn't like her wearing any kind of makeup. Phyllis sighed and slid the lipstick into her handbag. He wouldn't know it was there, and perhaps might not notice if she put some on during the evening. The spring on the front gate squeaked, heralding his arrival. "I'll get it," said her mother, before he had chance to knock at the door. Her mother's words of welcome drifted into the living room. "Robert, how nice to see you. Phyllis is nearly ready." "Good evening, Mrs. Mason. I trust you're keeping well." She heard her mother's response, accompanied by a tinkling laugh, and it almost sounded as though her mother was the one he was courting. Robert entered the living room, oozing self-assurance and smelling of Brill-cream. He was tall and lean, his back ramrod straight, and his sandy-coloured hair was matched by his eyelashes. Large blue eyes scrutinised her hair, her dress, and even the shoes she was wearing. He'd never used to do that, not until they'd become engaged. Now he scrutinised her and made comment, as though it was his God-given right to do so. With a nervous smile, Phyllis waited for him to find some imperfection in her appearance, for no matter how good she thought she looked, there always seemed to be something that wasn't right, at least in his eyes. At first she'd laughed off his comments, but with time found herself half believing that her choice of clothes, hairstyle or makeup was common. The result was that she found herself more diminished and more unsure of herself. "Your dress is very nice," Robert said, as though he was an expert on women's fashion. Her dress was green and scattered with white daisies, the collar a chaste Peter Pan style in white with matching cuffs. Phyllis was always pleased when he remarked favourably upon her dress, and for a moment she was elated, until a frown appeared on his face, and he commented on her hair, a coppery glow of colour which tonight bounced loosely on her shoulders. "It's a bit breezy out. You might want to think about tying your hair back, putting it up in a bun or something more respectable." "I said the same myself," said Phyllis's mother, rubbing her hands together, her eyes bright with enthusiasm for this young man who she believed was the best offer her daughter would ever get. "Here, let me deal with it." The tumbling mane that Phyllis had been so proud of was none too gently fastened up with pins and then bundled into a black snood. The colour didn't go with the dress, but she couldn't find the courage to stand up for herself. That's how it always was. Her mother approved of everything Robert said and did, as though being the son of a fellow member of the church congregation made him an expert on everything. Somehow, Phyllis had slipped into the habit of going out with him and couldn't quite recall the exact circumstances of their first date. She'd looked up to him back then, preened in the comments and envious looks of other girls. "Such a strong personality," her mother had said. Only now it seemed something different than strong. It was as though she couldn't get out from beneath a great weight that was becoming heavier and totally inescapable. She was trapped and couldn't get out. Confused and drained of self-pride, Phyllis felt like an obedient little dog as she followed him down the garden path. As yet, he had not told her where they were going. Once they were out on Marksbury Road, she dared ask him. "Engineer's Arms," he replied, without hesitation. He strode along purposefully, eyes straight ahead, her arm held tightly to his side. Her heart sank. Robert was nothing if not predictable. "We always go there. Can't we go somewhere else?" "I like it there. It's a good pint. And anyway, I've got to see Roger about the skittles on Friday, and Bill about the cricket match on Saturday. Wouldn't want to miss either of them now, would I?" He said it loftily, as though what he wanted was automatically what she wanted. The world, she thought, seen through his eyes. "If that's what you want," the words stuck in her throat. "Best get used to my timetable now before we're married, then you'll know exactly where I am any night of the week, or weekend, come to that, so you can plan meals and such like without any problem. Easy for you, easy for me too. I like to know what I'm eating on any given night when I get home after a hard day's work." His words were clipped, rattling inside her head like ricocheting bullets. Her mouth was dry, and it was hard to tell him how she wanted things to be. Any given night? What did that mean? Cold meat and pickles on Monday, meat and onion pie on Tuesday, eggs and chips on Wednesday? She balked at the thought of being so predictable. "I could work too," she said, with a sudden burst of courage and her brightest smile. "Not all women give up work when they get married." "Not my wife." The stridency of his voice made her jump. She kept reminding herself that he was a good catch. Everybody said so. She imagined how it would be to go to bed with him, the one thing he rarely mentioned, except that he expected her to do her wifely duties. Duty was the word her mother used too. But what about love? She wanted to ask. What about passion? She could feel the warmth of his thigh against hers as they walked along, his stride longer than hers. She glanced at his profile, the high forehead, the aquiline nose and fleshy, wide mouth. Had she ever thought him handsome? She couldn't remember thinking that. What she did remember were the looks other girls gave him, how they thought him a real dish, a real catch. Would they be so keen once they got to know him, to be told what makeup and clothes to wear? The manila envelope loomed large in her thoughts. Not wanting her mother to know she hadn't thrown it away, she'd hidden it beneath her underwear back in her bedroom. The very thought of achieving a qualification and a better job excited her. On the other hand, perhaps she should be grateful that a man wanted to marry her. It was what every girl dreamed of. Could she really live with Robert for the rest of her life? A set timetable of meals for all eternity. Am I unnatural? Phyllis wondered. Of late, she really preferred to be with the friendly crowd she worked with, rather than with Robert. Was it just him? Was there another man out there who would sweep her off her feet so she would gladly give up her job and her friends? The thoughts intensified. She fancied the engagement ring he'd given her was making her finger itch, and she wondered whether it was some kind of signal that it shouldn't be there. For the rest of that evening at the Engineer's Arms, she sat with her single drink amongst the others like her, girlfriends, some of whom were on the brink of becoming wives. She flicked her thumb at the offending finger. The itchiness had gone, but not the doubts connected with it. Robert kissed her goodbye at the garden gate and waved at the living-room window on the assumption that her mother was looking out, waiting for her to come home. "Good night. I'll see you during the week." Phyllis smiled and readily agreed, but her mind was on Friday, payday, when the girls she worked with went out on the town. She badly wanted to be with them, and somehow determined that she would. Her mother was waiting. "Nice night?" she asked, a look of self-satisfaction on her sharp features. "Yes," replied Phyllis. At the same time, she tried to find any aspect of the night that might be regarded as nice, but couldn't. It had been routine, boring. Her room overlooked the back garden and the red roofs of many other houses on the council estate. The red brick glistened when wet, and the privet hedges were dotted with sweet-smelling flowers. Beyond the rooftops, Phyllis could see ranks of Victorian terraced houses rising up to Windmill Hill. Lights twinkled from their windows, and the glow of sodium lamps splashed patches of orange along the main road. Not that she was really seeing any of it. In her mind, she was wondering at a different future than she'd envisaged, that didn't seem as plainly mapped out as she'd once thought. Chapter 4. Bridget, Phyllis, and Maisie. Despite her despicable home life, it wasn't in Maisie's nature to be nervous, but she was today, her first day of employment at W.D. and H.O. Wills. The woman who'd filled in the forms and given her an overall also gave her a brochure. "This is number 1 factory and only produces cigarettes such as Passing Cloud, Capstan and the very popular Woodbine. Castella and Whiffs are made in the cigar factory at Raleigh Road, Ashton. Your job will be stripping the leaves that go to make our most popular brands. The very best leaves come from Virginia, a state of the United States of America. Other brands used in blends come from Rhodesia and India." Maisie was only half listening. Even before entering its grand portals, she decided to hate this place and escape just as quickly as she could. The building resembled a huge temple peopled by many workers. So much noise, so much movement. Even outside, before stepping through the door, she'd watched as big wooden casks of tobacco were rolled into the works by sweating men in dark brown overalls. The woman, who wore a badge saying her name was Miss Cayford and that she was a supervisor, saw her looking and made further comment. "W.D. and H.O. Wills employ 13,000 people in this city alone, and they're all very well looked after. Your hours will be from 7 o'clock in the morning until 10 minutes past 5 at night. There is a 20-minute tea break in the morning and 1 hour for a cooked lunch, which is free for all employees. You will start on a wage of £3 a week and can earn an extra halfpenny for every extra pound of leaves stripped. There are other factories scattered throughout the country: Swindon, Glasgow, Newcastle. The tobacco comes into the bonded warehouses down on the Cumberland Basin, where the casks are weighed and the customs tariff applied. There's a tax on tobacco, you see." Maisie looked around her with a mixture of amazement and fear. The inside of the tobacco factory was huge and hummed with sound. Not having been brought up in the Bedminster area, she'd never been in such a place before. The factories close to where she lived were tiny in comparison, and made her feel tiny, as though she had landed here from a foreign land. The warm air was thick with dust, which tasted and smelt slightly sweet. Fat iron pillars with